So what is the problem? What is contamination? What is the behaviour or behaviours that you're trying to shift? And this is the bit where I always spend most time and suggest you do the same. Because at the end of the day, behaviour change isn't hard as long as you do the upfront thinking. And that's the most important bit of any behaviour change campaign. So I'm just going to say a bit more about the theory before we go into kind of practical examples and what you can be doing. So this is my own behavioural framework that I've developed over a number of years, which is all about making it easier for busy comms managers, waste managers, recycling managers, people working in those sorts of roles to apply behavioural insights. And for me, the process is spending a lot of time working out what is the behaviour you want to shift and examining those barriers. So as you can see on the screen, there's a lot that is about working out what is the behaviour you want to shift. So what are your objectives as a service? What are the key contaminants you want to shift? Thinking about getting that insight, looking at the kind of long list of behaviours. So thinking about what's happening, what are the different contaminants that we might want to target? Why are people behaving in a certain way? Looking at kind of segments and stuff like that, and then whittling it down to a short list of behaviours before you think about some of the barriers that you can potentially target. And then finally, the last bit would be very much thinking around what is it you do to run your campaign and evaluation. But for me, it's really all about doing that upfront thinking. And that's what I would argue is the most important bit. And sometimes there is a tendency and we can skip that. One thing that's really, really important is that with waste and recycling, all those kinds of issues in general, definitely with contamination, service delivery and communications go hand in hand. It's really difficult to work in silos. And one of the things I've found really, really helpful over the years is having a joint project group between the service and communications. So you're working together because so many things are intertwined when it comes to recycling and getting people to do the right thing. So when it comes to contamination, what is the actual problem? So many of you may have seen these stats before. So this is from RAP, the font of all knowledge of these kind of things. And this is from their annual tracker. So this is from last year, looking at recycling rates and things like that across the UK. So 90% of UK citizens regularly recycle. So it's a normalised behaviour. It's a lot of things that people do. A lot of people recycle. A lot of people see the benefit of recycling. But still, the problem is that contamination is high. So something like more than 80% of people put the wrong things into their recycling. And a lot of the time, people are wanting to do the right thing, but not quite getting it right. And also there's a lot of serious contaminants as well. So something like 37% at the last time this was done. So that's the kind of things that where people are putting something like a sanitary product into the recycling, something that causes a real problem for the recycling facility. So there's a number of different things there. So sometimes, a lot of the time, it's people want to do the right thing, but don't quite manage to. Other times, there'll be people who are just not doing the right thing at all and possibly don't want to. So in terms of, if we look at this in a bit more detail, and how many people are disposing of things incorrectly. So this is basically, on an average collection round, people will dispose of something like 5.4 items incorrectly. So it's improved a little bit since 2021, but it's still a big issue. So that's something that we really need to look at. What are those things that people getting wrong, so we can get people to recycle more of the right things more often? And another point I'll keep coming back to. So confusion about what you can and can't recycle nationally and locally is a big issue. So one of the things that's really important is thinking about consistency of message. So the Recycle Now swoosh has that kind of consistency to it and people understand it. So it's worth bearing that in mind and something I'll come back to. Okay, so where do you start? How do you work out what the problem is? How do you decide what contamination to focus on and what not to? So my first port of call would always be to speak to the service, spend some quality time with the waste and recycling service, thinking about what data is out there. So the types of things you can interrogate, depending on your local authority, will be things like contamination data by round. The waste composition analysis, which I spend lots of time reading through. So looking at different trends. So what kind of things are causing issues in general? What are the things that people across your local authority area are getting wrong? Also, what can the crews on the ground tell you? Not something that people always do. So thinking about what are they saying are hotspot areas? Which parts of your borough, your local authority, where are people getting it wrong, and what are the kind of key issues? And also surveys, focus groups, door knocking, all those kinds of things, as you would expect, are really, really useful. I just worked with a client on a massive door knocking exercise, and that was so useful to find out what the barriers were around contamination, and also photos as well, which I will come on to next. So when it comes to something like if you've got a number of kind of housing estates in your local area, walkabouts can be really, really helpful. So walking around an estate and looking at things like where bins are located, what are people putting in the bins, what can you see is happening? Are there recycling and household bins next to each other or not? Are the bins damaged? Are they overflowing? What are those kind of environmental barriers? So what's happening in your environment around you that's making a big difference? And that's something that we really need to look at carefully. So when you're planning your campaigns around contamination, once you've got that data, it's also worth thinking about looking at how you segment your audiences by living circumstances. So people who live in households versus housing estates / communal bin recycling will behave very differently to, say, people who live in flats and in different types of flats. So maybe flats in a block of flats versus flats above shops, and also families versus single households. There's a lot of trends you can see there. So it's worth thinking what's happening within those very discrete segments. So as I said earlier, when it comes to recycling and contamination, there's multiple barriers that we can look through and think about that will drive what people do. So if we want to bring it back to the theory, so one of the models I use is COMB, which is around things like capabilities around knowledge, opportunities around what's happening in your environment. And then there's things like motivation, about what people's attitudes are, what habits they have in place. And this is why it's important for the service and communications to join up, because a lot of the time there'll be multiple barriers to why people do and don't do the right thing when it comes to contamination. So if we take estates-based recycling, a lot of the times awareness will be the biggest or a very big issue, but actually with communal bins recycling, bins being full, people not trusting that it's going to get recycled, a lack of bins, lack of space in flats, missed bins, all those kinds of things, overflowing bins, all those things tied together to make a big, big difference to what people will do or not do. And also one thing that's really interesting is I run a lot of focus groups, and one of the things that comes out of that for me is that people have quite long memories, and it's quite interesting. So here's a conversation from a focus group about people. Someone said, oh yes, you could definitely use orange sacks for recycling. Someone else saying, oh no, you can only use clear bags. And people tend to have quite long memories when it comes to your policy on what you do with recycling. And sometimes if there's slightly different nuanced messages across the website or slightly different messages, things like that, that can confuse people quite easily. So having a really clear policy on what you can and can't put in the recycling, and then also what you can put, what sort of bags you can and can't put it in, and repeating that message over and over again is really important, because there is such a challenge with communicating what you can and can't recycle. So I'm going to move on now a bit to what the solution is. So we talked a bit about kind of behaviours, a bit about where you start. So what is it that we can all do in our organisations to tackle contamination? So for me, focusing on key contaminants is really important, and certainly where I've worked with organisations on thinking about what are the key things you want to shift and focusing on those in your communications. So if we bring it back to the theory, if you communicate too much to people, sometimes it can be a bit off-putting and they can't take it in. So yes, a leaflet or poster saying here are the things you can recycle and can't recycle is important, but it's a lot of information. So where I've done things and we've just focused on one or two items at a time. So if people are putting too much polystyrene in the wrong place, just focusing on polystyrene, or just focusing on nappies and just thinking, what are those key contaminants that people are getting wrong? We're much more likely to take that in, because a lot of the time we can't take in too much information. Also, consistency is really, really important. So when we're communicating with residents, consistency of the language we use, and also images around signs, bins, products in supermarkets, all those kinds of things, the more consistent it is, the more that people will understand what to do, because it's an area where people get conflicting messages. So it's just something to be really aware of. However, I would argue, and this is my personal view, that there is an exception to that, and that novelty can have a place. So as humans, we make something like 35,000 decisions a day. So here's some work that myself and John Paul have worked with an agency called Alive with Ideas, and this is a campaign we worked on for Tower Hamlets Council. So this was very much about doing something novel and fresh. So when you're doing something like a social media campaign, you're competing with lots of other graphics and images. So doing something a bit different and getting people's attention, disrupting their attention, is really, really important. And also having that clear kind of call to action. So again, it's kind of simple messages, not too many messages, and then just thinking about how you use that. Okay, so just to summarize then, in terms of the key things that I would suggest you do and how you can work through contamination, it's thinking about what are the specific behaviours you want to change, what is the problem, getting that really good insight, and then think about, when you're looking at that data, what can you see by different audiences? So how do houses behave? How do flats behave? Can you see any hotspot areas? Designing for behaviour change is really key. So thinking about how you disrupt people's attention. Are they getting something offline? Are they getting something online? What are the different ways you can communicate? Consistency is key. So having consistent language throughout what you do is really important. And also think about, how do you attract people's attention? How do you get them to take action and have simple messages that aren't too difficult to consume? And then I always say test and retest, because that's really, really helpful. And there's lots of ways you can do it to see if things are working or not working. So that is me. So that's a very quick whistle-stop tour of some thoughts on tackling contamination.